Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Rise and Fall of Nathaniel Barron. The morning sun glinted off the steel and glass towers that defined the skyline, casting long shadows across the bustling city streets below. On the 40th floor of the most prestigious building downtown, Nathaniel Barron stood at his floor-to-ceiling window. The city was his playground, and he had worked tirelessly to ensure it bowed to his will. Nathaniel was not a man who compromised. His tailored Italian suit fit like armor, every thread a testament to his wealth and power. The room behind him was a sanctuary of opulence, a hand-carved desk of rare Brazilian rosewood, a collection of abstract art curated by the world's most exclusive galleries, and leather furniture so plush it felt like sinking into a cloud. Everything about his office screamed dominance, an extension of the man who occupied it. 20 million as agreed, he said smoothly into his phone speaker. He didn't wait for a response, before ending the call with a decisive tap. Nathaniel prided himself on his decisiveness. In his world, hesitation was synonymous with failure. Rachel Carter, his assistant, entered the room quietly, clutching his morning coffee. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her movements measured, like a mouse trying not to provoke a lion. "Your coffee, Mr. Barron," she murmured. Nathaniel didn't bother turning around. The faintest wrinkle of his nose was the only acknowledgement of her presence. "Take it away," he said coldly. "I only drink Ethiopian beans in the morning. That smells like the inferior Colombian blend." Rachel flushed pink, her eyes darting to the floor. "I'm sorry, Mr. Barron. I'll fix it immediately." She exited as quickly as she had entered, leaving Nathaniel to revel in his solitude. Nathaniel loved power, and he wielded it with precision. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. He didn't care that people feared him, in fact, he preferred it. Fear was an effective motivator. Later that evening, Nathaniel was the star of an exclusive celebration at the Cardinal Club, the city's most elite private venue. Champagne flowed like water, and the room was filled with the glittering elite who orbited Nathaniel like moths drawn to a flame. He held court at the center of the room, recounting his latest conquest, the hostile takeover of a mid-sized tech company that had underestimated his cunning. "They thought they had the upper hand," Nathaniel laughed, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a knife. "But when I revealed my stake in their Asian markets, they crumbled. It was like watching a house of cards collapse." The crowd laughed obligingly, their admiration for Nathaniel evident in their sycophantic smiles. Nathaniel basked in their approval, the pinnacle of success and power. Across town, in a modest apartment lit by a single warm lamp, Amara Johnson adjusted her black serving uniform in front of a small mirror. The fabric was worn but clean, the creases smooth to perfection. Her mother's photograph sat on the dresser, a source of strength and a reminder of her purpose. Her mother's smile was radiant, even captured in stillness. "I'll make you proud, Mom," Amara whispered, her fingers lightly brushing the frame before she grabbed her bag and headed for work. The Lamison restaurant was the crown jewel of the city's dining scene, a place where the wealthy and influential came to dine in luxury. Amara had worked there for 3 years, weaving through the tables with the grace of a dancer. She was efficient, polite, and unyieldingly professional, even in the face of the restaurant's notoriously demanding clientele. That evening, as Amara balanced plates of culinary masterpieces that cost more than her monthly rent, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The whispers started before she even saw him, a ripple of anticipation that swept through the dining room. Nathaniel Barron had arrived. The maitre d' practically stumbled over himself to guide Nathaniel and his entourage to their reserved table. The best table in the house, naturally. Nathaniel entered like a king surveying his domain, his expression one of detached superiority. Amara braced herself as she approached their table. She had served Nathaniel before and knew his reputation well. He was exacting, dismissive, and quick to anger, a volatile combination for someone in her position. "Good evening, sir," she said evenly, forcing a smile. "Welcome to Lamison. May I start you off with something to drink?" Nathaniel didn't even glance at her, his attention focused on his phone. "Your service is slipping," he said, his tone clipped. "I expect better when I'm paying these prices." Amara's cheeks burned, but she nodded, determined not to let his words affect her. "Of course, sir. I'll ensure everything is perfect." The evening wore on, a symphony of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the gentle notes of the grand piano in the corner. Amara worked tirelessly, her feet aching from hours of standing, but she maintained her poise, her mother's words echoing in her mind, "No matter what, hold your head high." As she approached Nathaniel's table with a tray of red wine glasses, a young couple at a nearby table suddenly pushed their chairs back, blocking her path. Amara tried to sidestep, but her heel caught on the plush carpet. The tray wobbled in her hands, and before she could regain her balance, a glass of wine tipped. Time seemed to slow as the deep red liquid arced through the air, landing with cruel precision on Nathaniel's pristine white shirt and his tailored designer suit jacket. The restaurant fell silent. Conversations halted, forks froze mid-air, and even the piano seemed to falter. Every eye in the room turned to Nathaniel's table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Amara's heart raced as she looked up at Nathaniel. His face was a mask of fury, his cold gray eyes piercing through her. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Barron," she stammered, her voice trembling. Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair, the weight of his presence suffocating. He stared down at Amara, his expression unreadable, but the storm brewing in his eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, it seemed like he might simply walk away, his disdain too great to even address her. But then, in a flash of anger, he raised his hand. The slap echoed through the restaurant, a sharp, humiliating sound that reverberated off the walls. Amara's cheek stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the shame and disbelief that flooded her. The room collectively held its breath. Time seemed to freeze as Nathaniel stared at Amara, his chest heaving with anger. But he hadn't just crossed a line, he had obliterated it. And in that moment, as the world around them watched in stunned silence, Nathaniel Barron had no idea just how much his life was about to change. The whispers begin. The restaurant was a mausoleum of silence. Every patron, waiter, and staff member stood frozen, their gazes fixed on the scene that had just unfolded. Amara remained rooted to the spot, her cheek burning, her heart pounding in her chest. She fought the tears that threatened to spill, determined not to let him see her break. Nathaniel Barron, however, seemed oblivious to the gravity of what he had done. He adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced indifference, as though striking a woman, an employee, no less, was no more consequential than brushing lint off his sleeve. "Get her out of here," he commanded coldly, his voice carrying across the room like a judge's gavel. Before Amara could respond, the restaurant manager, Philip Dorsey, rushed forward, his face pale and strained. Philip had been in the industry long enough to know that protecting high-profile clients was paramount, even if it meant sacrificing his staff. "Amara," Philip said quietly, his hand on her arm, "let's go to the back for a moment." Amara hesitated. She wanted to stand her ground, to demand an apology, to call out the injustice in front of the assembled crowd. But the weight of every eye in the room bore down on her, and she relented, following Philip toward the kitchen. Behind the swinging doors, the staff whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of pity and anger. Amara avoided their gazes, her mind racing. She wasn't just humiliated, she was furious. She had endured rudeness, insults, and dismissive treatment before, but this was different. This was an assault. "Amara, I'm so sorry," Philip began, wringing his hands nervously. "I'll make this right, I promise. Please, just go home for the night. I'll handle Mr. Barron." Amara stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew what handling meant, appeasing Nathaniel, ensuring his continued patronage, and sweeping the incident under the rug. "I'll go," Amara said quietly, her voice steady, despite the turmoil within. "But this isn't over." That night, Amara sat alone in her modest apartment, her cheek still stinging from the slap. Her mother's photo seemed to gaze at her with quiet encouragement, a reminder of the resilience that had been instilled in her since childhood. She wasn't powerless, not anymore. Amara opened her laptop and began typing. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as she recounted the night's events in vivid detail. She didn't embellish or exaggerate, she didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. Her post, titled "When Power Goes Too Far, My Experience with Nathaniel Barron," was raw and emotional, a first-hand account of the humiliation she had suffered at the hands of one of the city's most powerful men. She uploaded it to her social media accounts and went to bed, unsure of what would come next, but unwilling to stay silent. By morning, the post had gone viral. Nathaniel sat in his luxurious penthouse, unaware of the storm brewing just outside his gilded walls. He sipped his morning espresso, flipping through the financial section of the paper, satisfied with the headlines touting his latest acquisition. His satisfaction was interrupted by Rachel, his assistant, who entered the room with a strained expression. "Mr. Barron," she began hesitantly, holding her tablet. "There's something you need to see." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. Rachel hesitated before setting the tablet down in front of him. The screen displayed Amara's post, along with thousands of comments, likes, and shares. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Hashtag Nathaniel Barron exposed, hashtag power and privilege, and hashtag justice for Amara were just a few of the hashtags dominating social media. News outlets had already picked up the story, broadcasting the incident to a global audience. Nathaniel's face darkened as he scrolled through the comments. Words like monster, coward, and abuser jumped out at him, a stark contrast to the praise he was accustomed to. "She's lying," Nathaniel said dismissively, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "There are witnesses, sir. The restaurant staff, the patrons, it's not just her word." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "So what? A few days of bad press, and this will blow over. Get our PR team on it. Issue a statement denying everything." But it wasn't going to blow over, and Nathaniel knew it. His pristine image, the foundation of his empire, was crumbling, and there was nothing he hated more than losing control. Amara's phone buzzed incessantly as messages of support poured in. Activists, journalists, and even lawyers reached out, offering to amplify her voice or represent her in legal action. She hadn't expected the overwhelming response, but she welcomed it. For the first time, she felt the weight of public opinion shifting in her favor. Amara sat down with a journalist from a prominent news outlet who wanted to feature her story. She spoke candidly about her experience, her voice steady but emotional as she recounted the humiliation and pain of that night. The article was published the next day, and it painted a damning portrait of Nathaniel Barron. It highlighted his history of mistreating employees, his reputation for ruthlessness, and the unchecked power that had enabled his behavior for so long. As more people came forward with their own stories of mistreatment at Nathaniel's hands, the tide turned. The whispers grew louder, and Nathaniel's carefully constructed facade began to unravel. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel faced mounting pressure. His investors grew uneasy, his stock prices dipped, and his invitations to high-profile events mysteriously dried up. The final blow came when a former business associate leaked documents implicating Nathaniel in a series of unethical practices. It wasn't just his reputation on the line anymore, it was his entire empire. Nathaniel sat in his once mighty office, now a shadow of its former glory. The art had been removed, the furniture sold, and the room felt empty, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel felt powerless. And in the quiet of his downfall, he began to think about the woman he had struck, the woman whose courage had sparked a movement. Amara Johnson was no longer just a waitress, she was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that no amount of power or privilege could shield someone from accountability. And for Nathaniel Barron, the lesson would haunt him for the rest of his life. The secret revealed. Nathaniel Barron paced the echoing emptiness of his penthouse, the walls closing in on him despite their grand scale. His empire was crumbling, and the scandal refused to die down. No PR statement, no legal threats, and no half-hearted apology seemed to stem the tide of public outrage. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in, but what haunted him most was the question he couldn't shake: who was Amara Johnson? She wasn't just a waitress. That much was clear. There was something about her, the way she carried herself, the defiance in her eyes even after his reprehensible act, that unnerved him. She wasn't a victim in the way he had expected, she was a force, and she was dismantling everything he had built. Nathaniel instructed his private investigator to dig deeper. "I want to know everything about her," he barked into the phone. "Where she's from, who she knows, her history, everything." The investigator hesitated on the other end. "Mr. Barron, with all due respect, pursuing her could worsen the situation. You're already under fire." Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Just do your job." Meanwhile, Amara was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. She had always been a private person, content with her quiet life and her modest aspirations. But now, she was thrust into the public eye as a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power. Despite the support she received, there were whispers of disbelief and attempts to discredit her. Some questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking fame or financial gain. The scrutiny was exhausting, but Amara remained steadfast. Her story had ignited a movement, and she couldn't back down now. One evening, as she sat in her living room scrolling through the endless messages on her phone, a knock at the door startled her. Opening it cautiously, she found a man in his late 50s, dressed in a weathered suit. His face was kind but weary, and his eyes held a familiarity she couldn't place. "Amara Johnson?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her guard up. "I'm Victor Ellis," he said, extending a hand. "I think it's time you knew the truth about your father." Amara's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been a distant, shadowy figure in her life. Her mother had always evaded questions about him, and the topic had become a silent taboo in their household. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Victor hesitated, then handed her a folder. "He's not who you think he is." Inside the folder were documents, photographs, and letters that told a story Amara had never imagined. Her father, Charles Whitmore, was once a prominent civil rights attorney, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice. But his work had made him powerful enemies, and when Amara was a child, he was forced into hiding after exposing a corrupt corporate conglomerate. One of the companies he had brought down? Barron Industries, during its early years. Nathaniel's father, Harold Barron, had been at the center of the scandal. He had been implicated in a series of illegal land deals and labor exploitation schemes, and Charles Whitmore's legal crusade had nearly destroyed the family empire. But Charles had paid a heavy price. His career was ruined, his family forced into secrecy, and his name erased from public records. Amara realized with a start that her mother's insistence on staying under the radar wasn't just caution, it was survival. Her blood boiled as she pieced it all together. The slap wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a bitter echo of a deeper history. Victor's revelation set Amara on a new path. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was seeking justice for her family's legacy. With Victor's help, she began gathering evidence, unearthing documents that tied Barron Industries to years of corruption and exploitation. The pieces started falling into place, and Amara realized that Nathaniel's arrogance and violence weren't anomalies, they were the culmination of a toxic dynasty built on power and privilege. Back in his office, Nathaniel stared at the investigator's report with growing unease. Amara's lineage was a bombshell. Learning that her father was Charles Whitmore, a name that had haunted his family's legacy for decades, was a twist he hadn't anticipated. The revelation hit him like a freight train. The humiliation he had inflicted on Amara wasn't just a PR nightmare, it was the ignition of a feud his family had barely survived once before. For the first time, Nathaniel felt a flicker of fear. As the scandal grew, Amara took her evidence to a trusted journalist. The resulting exposé was explosive. It linked Barron Industries to decades of unethical practices, from environmental violations to worker exploitation, all protected by a web of bribes and intimidation. Amara's father's role in exposing the corruption became a focal point of the story, shining a light on the sacrifices he had made to stand up for justice. The fallout was immediate. Investors fled Barron Industries, lawsuits piled up, and regulatory agencies launched investigations. Nathaniel found himself facing a reckoning he could no longer control. One night, as the city buzzed with news of the unfolding scandal, Nathaniel showed up unannounced at Amara's modest apartment. She opened the door, her expression unreadable as she faced the man who had caused her so much pain. "What do you want, Mr. Barron?" she asked, her tone steady but cold. Nathaniel hesitated, his once unshakable confidence now a shadow of itself. "I came to apologize," he said finally. Amara's eyes narrowed. "An apology? After everything? Do you think that fixes anything?" Nathaniel's shoulders sagged, the weight of his downfall etched into his face. "No. But I need you to know. I'm not the man my father was." Amara crossed her arms. "Maybe you aren't. But you've spent your life protecting his empire, benefiting from the harm he caused. And when you had the chance to be better, you chose cruelty." Nathaniel had no response. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the unspoken truth. Amara finally spoke. "You think coming here makes you noble, but it doesn't. Real redemption isn't about words, Mr. Barron, it's about actions. And I'm not the one you owe that to. It's the people your family hurt, the lives they destroyed. You have a lot of work to do, and none of it involves me." She closed the door, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the hallway, a man stripped of his power and illusions. Amara's story had become a rallying cry for change, inspiring others to speak out against injustice and abuse of power. Though her journey had been painful, she had emerged stronger, her voice a beacon for those who had been silenced. And for Nathaniel Barron, the lesson she taught him would haunt him for the rest of his life. A reckoning and redemption. Nathaniel Barron sat alone in his now muted penthouse, the skyline that once symbolized his dominion now a reminder of all he had lost. The sharp clang of silence was deafening. His company was in shambles, his fortune reduced, and his name, a name that once opened doors, was now synonymous with disgrace. The media continued its relentless coverage of the scandal, unearthing skeletons buried deep in Barron Industries' past. Lawsuits mounted daily, led by activists and former employees emboldened by Amara Johnson's courage. Nathaniel's high-priced legal team had dwindled, many of them fleeing as his ability to pay evaporated. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel wasn't the man in control. Across town, Amara Johnson stood before a podium in a crowded community center. Her story, now well known, had inspired a coalition of grassroots organizations to gather and address corporate abuses of power. The room buzzed with anticipation as journalists, activists, and everyday citizens awaited her words. Amara adjusted the microphone, her hand steady, despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. She had never intended to become a public figure, but life had a way of pulling people into roles they were meant to play. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and resolute. "I never expected my life to intersect with someone like Nathaniel Barron. I never thought I'd stand here, speaking to all of you about justice, accountability, and resilience. But here we are, and I believe this moment is bigger than any single person, including me." The crowd erupted in applause, but Amara held up her hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or told they didn't matter. It's about those who have suffered under systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Together, we can change that." Her words electrified the room. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and cameras flashed. Amara's quiet strength had become a symbol of hope for a society craving accountability. Nathaniel watched the speech from a small, sparsely furnished room he had rented after selling his penthouse. His fall from grace had left him with little but time to reflect, and Amara's words echoed in his mind. For weeks, he had vacillated between denial and anger. He had blamed everyone but himself, the media, his investors, even his father's legacy. But as the dust settled, a painful truth emerged: this was his doing. Nathaniel began digging into the history of Barron Industries, determined to confront the realities he had ignored for so long. The records were damning. His father, Harold Barron, had built their empire on exploitation, and Nathaniel had perpetuated those practices under the guise of ambition and progress. One document stood out, a report detailing Charles Whitmore's investigation into Barron Industries. Nathaniel read every word, his stomach twisting as he realized the lengths his father had gone to in silencing the man who had tried to expose the truth. Charles Whitmore wasn't just Amara's father, he was a man of integrity, someone who had sacrificed everything for justice. And Nathaniel, blinded by privilege and pride, had lashed out at the daughter of the very man his family had wronged. Determined to make amends, Nathaniel contacted Victor Ellis, the man who had revealed the truth to Amara. Convincing Victor to meet him wasn't easy, but after days of persistence, Victor agreed to a brief conversation at a quiet cafe. "I don't trust you," Victor said bluntly, his eyes hard as he sipped his coffee. "And I don't think Amara will either." Nathaniel nodded. "I don't blame you. But I need to find a way to set things right, not just for her, but for everyone my family has hurt." Victor studied him for a long moment before sighing. "If you're serious about this, start with transparency. Open the books, release the records, and dismantle the systems your father built. Actions speak louder than words, Barron." The next few months were a whirlwind of accountability and change. Nathaniel took Victor's advice to heart, hiring an independent firm to audit Barron Industries and publish their findings. The report exposed decades of corruption, prompting further legal action but also initiating a shift toward reform. Nathaniel personally reached out to the families of those his company had wronged, offering restitution where he could and apologizing where restitution wasn't enough. He sold off his remaining assets, using the funds to establish a foundation dedicated to promoting corporate responsibility and supporting whistleblowers like Charles Whitmore. The foundation bore Whitmore's name, a small but significant gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Amara watched these developments with a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. Nathaniel's efforts seemed genuine, but years of mistrust weren't easily erased. One day, she received an envelope containing a handwritten letter. "Dear Ms. Johnson, I owe you an apology, but I know that words alone are hollow. My actions have caused you pain, and they have perpetuated harm far beyond what I can ever repair. But I am trying. Your father was a great man, and though I never knew him, I am beginning to understand the strength it must have taken for him to stand against my family. You inherited that strength, and I see now that it is what the world needs most. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you have changed me. Thank you for holding me accountable. I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor the courage you've shown. Sincerely, Nathaniel Barron ****. Amara read the letter several times, her emotions shifting from anger to sadness to something resembling hope. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she couldn't deny the sincerity in his words. Months later, Nathaniel stood before a different podium, addressing a gathering of activists and corporate leaders. The room was far from the luxury he once reveled in, but it was filled with people who shared his newfound mission, creating a world where power was wielded responsibly. I spent my life believing that power made me untouchable, Nathaniel said, his voice steady but humble. But true power lies in accountability, in recognizing our mistakes, and in striving to do better. I've learned that from people far braver than me, people like Amara Johnson. Amara sat in the audience, her expression unreadable, but her presence undeniable. She hadn't forgiven him fully, but she had agreed to attend, acknowledging the importance of what they were building together. And as Nathaniel stepped down from the stage, he knew his journey toward redemption was far from over. But for the first time, he was walking a path worth taking, guided by the light of the very people he had once tried to extinguish.